Welcome, citizens of the globe, to the Frontend Heroes podcast, where we discuss all things villainous and heroic about the front end of software development. My name is Evan Payne, and with me, as always, is my co-host, Scott Francis. How are you, Scott?
I'm really good today, Evan. Thanks. I had a really enjoyable morning. I actually went swimming this morning before starting work. Nice. It was super nice. I went out expecting the sea to be really cold, and it wasn't. It was really nice, and swam out and watched the sunrise while I was in the water. It was like idyllic. So yeah, I'm in a pretty good mood.
That's pretty amazing. That's why you live by the Mediterranean. So,
yeah.
I'm doing good too. It's a few weeks till my vacations start, and I need them, so it's all good. I'm currently sitting outside up on my terrace, which is beautiful, and it's not raining today, so that's nice as well. Today's episode is sponsored by NetCentric, an award-winning Adobe Global Alliance partner. Both Scott and I work here as senior front-end software engineers, and we are still glad to have their support with this show. Today's episode is called 12 Monkeys, but with Batman. And it's the topic in general is asynchronous code and how frontenders have to deal with events that don't happen in direct order. But coming up with an episode title was surprisingly difficult, related to superheroes, because while we know storylines related to time travel, Superman turning the planet backwards and Doctor Strange doing some stuff, there don't seem to be any like, this guy's superpower is time travel stuff. And I know there are, please don't like yell at me on Twitter or something, but pop culture wise, it's not as prevalent. And I wonder why that might be.
Because I would say because Back to the Future has everything covered. If you want time travel, then just go to Marty McFly and Doc Brown.
Yeah, so and you know, like I think a lot of people, well, hopefully a lot of people know 12 Monkeys. If you don't, watch the movie and then maybe watch the TV show. I don't really know, but you know, neither Back to the Future or this are superheroes. So, you know, it's interesting that generally it's like only science allows time travel, and they figure it out somehow. But what I wanted to lead into with that is that it's complicated, and I think that's why it doesn't take off in pop culture, because every time travel movie is really hard to figure out what's going on and follow the loops. And remember, like Memento and things like that, where it wasn't time travel, but it was still time related, and it was super complex. And our brains are not really set up for that. So yeah, that for me segues into our segment is, asynchronous is kind of hard. But yeah, I mean, what's been your experience with it, Scott? Maybe, you know, promises or even earlier callbacks and things like that. How have you had to deal with it?
I can really remember like working with callbacks, but my experience with that was limited. Actually, my first real experiences as like an engineer with it was using promises when I was working in my first Angular project. And I echo your thoughts there that it was hard. Like for me, it was one thing that I really, really struggled with. Whether it was actually like the concept of the promise, or whether it was just that for some reason I couldn't get my head around the syntax of it. But it was something that I did struggle with. And now I've actually just said that, I think that it was probably really for me the syntax and getting used to that, because the concept of actually of the promise is, I suppose, is it difficult? It actually is, isn't it? Because you're asking for something and knowing that something is going to be there, but it's not there. If I'm like, that's how I could summarize it. Like which does seem totally weird.
Yeah. Well, what blew my mind when I was first learning promises, and I remember I had to like use Bluebird library, or I think I was trying to do it in Node and I had to use Q or something. Anyway, it was already the edge of my understanding at that time. And it was really like, I don't even really understand JavaScript that well at that stage. And I'm trying to do this thing which none of the tutorials talk about. I mean, yeah, now they do, but back then it was like, yeah, this is new. We should have had this in from the language from the start, but we have added it on afterwards as a afterthought. And now you can do this thing where you create a new promise. And I'm like, I don't know what that is yet. So my problem with it was compounded. It was not just asynchronous and dealing with like this stuff, but it was also using class features and using like new instances of things, and I just wasn't ready for that. It's a lot to take in all at once when you're just starting in JavaScript.
Yeah, it really is, and I'd echo that. I think that maybe we were at the same stage, because as I think I've mentioned before on this podcast, that my time in the industry was not always time spent as what I would call an engineer, which I would consider myself to be now. But and so going from not being an engineer to like working in an Angular project where we've decided that we're going to use promises was a hell of a leap. And I think that maybe like that wasn't really helping my understanding. I mean, like at the end, it is more complex than I think that people would actually care to admit. I think something in our industry is something new comes out and people really want to demonstrate that they can use it and they can understand it. And it almost like for some people, it becomes like really difficult to say, do you know, I just don't get this. Like I'm missing something here, like, because they don't want to look like the one who doesn't understand it when everybody else seems to. And maybe personally, I was at that stage there. I was just, trying to work out how Angular worked. I never worked with it. Trying to work out how promises worked. And so it was that was actually quite a daunting time, but we're there now.
Yeah, definitely. I do remember around that time, or well, no, anyway, early days at our workplace. I really wanted to go to senior, and I thought I was ready. And our architect came up and asked me a question about promises, and I was just like, I've used them like once, and I was like hemming and hawing and not quite answering. And he referenced that later in the not performance review, but like the I don't think he's ready to go to senior review, where he was like, and he didn't really even know how promises worked. And like, it's hard. And, the thing is, promises only solve like one asynchronous thing. At least they have like they have then and then they have catch. But there's a whole other host of things that can happen, and you want to do another asynchronous thing afterwards. You have a nested promise, and then you're back to like nesting. And that was what the reason promises were nice, to remove callback hell, where you have one callback and another and another and another. But so then someone created RxJS. Or anyway, Rx in general, reactive thinking. And I use this constantly now, but I remember Angular implemented it. Angular 2 implemented RxJS kind of as part of how it worked. And you start to like, you figure out how it works through using Angular. And then you're like, okay, I want to use more of this. I'm starting to get how observables work. I'm starting to understand and think in streams, but it is still really hard. Even like 2.5, 3 years on, there are still times where I just get like stumped and stuck, because I'm like, well, this thing fired an asynchronous event. It got pushed into the stream. And now I've got these 4 other asynchronous events that I'm also checking for. And now all of them seem to be firing at once. Why is that? Oh, it's because the combine latest operator does that. And it's like, but oh man, how do I refactor that? It gets really, really complex.
So like, yeah, I mean, you're taking me into territory now that like I don't really know. And so like, how do you deal with this then? I mean, you're working in an application, you're building an application that relies on this sort of stuff, whereas I'm currently working in a project which doesn't require it. We don't really have state. So like, how do you go about deciding the architecture for this kind of thing?
Yeah. So because we were working with Angular already, the first thing was, okay, well then we want to be all in with reactive, which is to say, if a user clicks on a button and that is going to change the state in some way, that should be an observable stream. So that button's click, add event listener click, those should be transformed into push into this observable stream. So then you have an existing stream that can be tapped into to perform various operations and side effects. So starting to think in that way is the most important thing. And it's not easy to do. You're used to it. Sometimes the actual way the DOM works does not lend itself to this. But you can, with any event, you can use from event. There's an observable creator method that allows you to just turn it into a stream. So you do have some helper things with that. But then trying to wrap your mind around it, everything should be this way. It's much different from your normal kind of imperative style programming. You have to do everything when the component is being set up. So, okay, yeah, I want to listen to this click event. I don't do it in like a method that fires when the click event happens. I do it in the constructor of the component, and I say, hey, this stream exists, tap into it, combine it with this other thing, something that comes from the parent. Sometimes I even turn my Angular inputs into streams, behavior subjects, so that I can push them into this stream and combine them and mix them together. It's a lot. It's really confusing at first, but after a while it starts to flow.
So now you've worked with this like a lot, and do you now think that this is like better than anything that we've had before? Do you think that this is like the way to work, or is it something that is very much like project dependent? Like, for instance, it's often said that if you work with a framework, if you work with like Angular all the time, then your answer to every problem could become like, let's make an Angular application. Do you think that this is something like similar? Once you get into it, you think that everything should use this like reactive programming, or is it very much something that's like that suits a project?
I may be the wrong person to ask about that, because I am very much the one that goes, okay, I want to do this new thing. And as soon as I know that there's a backend call involved, so some sort of asynchronous call, or that there is some sort of state, I go for Angular and I go for NgRx and I go for, RxJS built in, because like I'm comfortable with that. I know that I'm super fast at it. So yeah, my answer would be, yeah, sure. Just use it everywhere. And I know that's not correct. For sure. There are times when you really don't need this. It's the same thing. One of my mentors, as you will, used to tell me, Redux and state management is great, but you don't really reach for it out of the box. You'll know when you need it. And that has been true as well. An example would be with NgRx. On the current project I'm working on, we started setting it up and I said, okay, maybe I don't need NgRx. We have internal state. We have services. Maybe it's enough using reactive programming to have some observable that lives in the service, and then the other components can tap into it because it's essentially a singleton. It's injected only once throughout the whole app. Maybe this is appropriate. And what I found was within 2 weeks of development, really weird stuff was happening, and like things were firing twice or not at all, and it just was not making sense. And it makes me like doubt that I knew what I was doing. And at that stage I went, well, screw it. I know that NgRx in particular is going to provide me with some safety around everything. I'm just going to implement that. Whether it feels like it's too heavy or not, we're just going to do it. And since then we haven't had those issues. So
yeah, I mean, like, I don't. Is the cost, like the weight of using this, like so much that it's not a good solution? I mean, does it really like impact performance if you use it where perhaps you could use something else? I mean, is it something that's like for sure using a framework where you don't need it? It's just adding like huge amounts of extra weight. But is this the same thing?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I haven't measured the cost. It's quite verbose, which is to say you write a lot of code in the end, especially with NgRx. So you, for any given flow, the component, like, well, in the way that I write it, I create a facade. So I create this sort of public API for the bit of the store, the bit of the state that I want to expose. And I say, yeah, this is the, news store, but it's the facade for that. And then I would say get articles or load articles. The component would say that. And then under the hood in this facade, it would do the dispatch an action. The action would get picked up. There would be a side effect. So it would say, hey, whenever this action comes into the stream, do this asynchronous call. And then when you get the response back, whatever it is, dispatch another action, which is either success or fail. And then the reducer picks up the tail end of that and pushes it back into the global state. And then you have selectors, which are memoized versions of the state. So they only update or fire a new stream event to the listeners when that part of the state is updated, and the component in return subscribes to the that selector that's exposed by the facade. So it's roundabout. It seems like a lot. There certainly are a lot of files per patch of state, and yet I have so many. I don't have many bugs anymore related to this kind of stuff. If the backend gives me this response, I'm confident that the component knows exactly what it's getting and that it'll come into my component's stream of things that it's listening to and merge perfectly with all of the local storage that's happening there, or the local component state. It's a lot, and there's a lot of files, and maybe there's a lot of code. I hope a lot of it gets taken away by gzip, but at the end of the day, I know exactly what's happening, and I know there's a right place for everything I need to happen in that structure, in that flow, and I'm secure. So maybe that's worth the trade-off. That being said, I have not measured it. So maybe I'm totally off base and it's adding an extra 2 megabytes or something.
Yeah, I think you would have noticed a huge impact like that. But I think that it raises, it makes me think, does this kind of thing cut down on your any edge cases that there are, certainly I imagine this completely gets rid of race conditions. So it's something that we see quite a lot when we develop. I mean, maybe people have got cleverer with this, but I still see people have problems, and basically it's this is a race condition. Whereas how you're describing reactive programming, it seems like you're almost taking that out of the equation if it's done correctly. Is that right?
Mostly. So it gets rid of a lot of those. And one thing is it makes certain things trivially easy. So there was this one thing I had to implement where the user would click on something and it would send it off the request to the backend, and then depending on while it was sending, there would be a loading spinner, and then inside this little modal overlay, and then when the response came back, there would be an animated check mark that displayed for 3 seconds, and then the modal would close. That is a lot, and it's complicated, and you have to do a lot of checks and all of that, but it took an hour, and the actual bit of waiting 3 seconds after, even if removing the server call, click on the button, wait 3 seconds, and then close it. That was also really simple. Maybe it is simple, but I feel like it would have taken a lot more code than it did, and that was cool. But the race conditions aren't always removed. We have in our thing, there's something that sets when you navigate, that sets the global theme, but then another component also was setting the theme. So they were firing a similar action, and one was happening immediately after the other, and it got a little messy there. So you have to be careful still, but there are a whole host of things that get removed in that case.
That is nice. I mean, I think that's something that would really appeal to me, and I think that it would be something that would really help. It's a strange thing because I'm about to say this is something that I think would really help like new coders, new like junior developers, because they're more likely, I think, to see things with race conditions. Like, but also this seems like a complex step and a complex methodology for like newer people to actually grasp. So I don't know whether there would be a trade-off there, like something worth going straight into like reactive thinking.
So the thing is that the setup is not that easy. I mean, maybe it's gotten easier, and if you're just doing no framework, just RxJS, it's okay. But I think even so, like, observable creation is a hard thing to understand. Observables versus subjects. That's also, I still don't quite get it. I definitely understand streams, and I definitely understand once the observable exists, or once I have a behavior subject, that makes perfect sense to me somehow. Sure, no problem from there. But the actual like creation and like hot versus cold and all that stuff never clicked for me yet. But once you have it set up and it's already working in your project, like when Angular implemented it in and it's just kind of present, then it's not so hard to pick up. We had on an internal project, one of our developers was, an associate level, not junior, but, new enough to this. And she did struggle with understanding the flow of Flux methodology, and especially with side effects added in, which isn't always present. But once she got it, she came to appreciate the safety it provided. And I think that was the key, is that after a while, she started to see, oh, okay, yeah, it's a lot of places to like write your code, but everything has a place and it just works. That's been really nice to see and sort of prove that it is worth the effort to understand.
Yeah. So you mentioned there, like you've alluded to it a couple of times, like the extra coding, the extra like almost that abstraction, if you like. Now, one of the things that frontenders like, particularly about JavaScript, is the fast and loose style for the language. Do you think that this? I mean, we see with things like TypeScript that there's that things are getting like tighter. Do you think that using something like this is also moving away from like the traditional like fast-paced nature of front end in favor of security and reliability?
I mean, not necessarily, because I think you don't have to use TypeScript with it. But again, you're asking the wrong person, because I don't like that. I don't like that it's fast and loose. I don't like that. I mean, I've seen so many bugs where nothing yelled at me when I passed this as a number and it should have been a string, until I got to the moment where I parsed it incorrectly and it like broke the freaking website. I don't like that. I really appreciate the security. Like, we even had a bug the other day where I did some refactoring, changed some things, removed some stuff a month ago. And the only reason it was working is because it expected a Boolean for this third argument, and I provided an object that I wasn't using. So it still was returning true. So the thing that wanted it to be true was still working. But then when I removed the second argument and left the third one in, something like that, now suddenly it was getting false. And I was like, what happened here? And it was because I passed through an object instead of a Boolean. Like, oh my God, you should have yelled at me for that. That's not okay. And okay, there's some times where fast and loose is okay, right? Like, you want to evaluate if this is null or undefined or something, or exists or not, right? True or false, Boolean essentially. But the rest of it, I don't like, and it really, for me, it has the potential to introduce way too many bugs. That's all. So to get back to your question, I don't think that this kind of asynchronous programming necessarily stops you from doing that, because inside the actual mapping of stream events or promise callbacks or whatever, you still can do whatever you want. But that it has built-in support for TypeScript, or that TypeScript supports it, is very invaluable for keeping track of what you're actually passing around. My question back to you maybe is, okay, so you're not using this sort of stuff. And for me, it's become invaluable, especially when dealing with server calls. Like I have a service, so I know like, okay, the component is never allowed to say http.get or fetch this. Like it's never allowed to do that. It has to hand off to a service. One that reduces repetition of code, and two lets me add in interceptors or do special conditions just for that service and things like that. But also then it's in its right place. It's only allowed to be from a service that HTTP calls are made. How do you deal with that in your project if you're not using a larger framework or you're not using kind of any reactive style stuff?
I guess that the answer would be we still do things like in a traditional way. I mean, like we still have like a central function that would handle like calls to APIs, and they would just get the data back, like very like old fashioned, if you like. But we still use that method. So we don't repeat the code because we just have a utility function which we pass like a URL into, and then make the call to an API, and receive the data back. But we don't really do anything like more, I wouldn't say like more complex, but we still rely on that, basically. We still rely on the old ways. And up to now, like that works for us. But I think that the project that I currently work on is what you would say is a traditional website. It doesn't have like we have Angular applications, which are old now, for want of a better word, and they're established, and thankfully they're coded well enough that they don't really have any defects. They can just exist. But those Angular applications do kind of have state in them. My only real experience with them is through these of using like state is through these Angular applications. So I'm not completely lost when I hear you talk about the concepts. I have worked in a project where we had actions, we had reducers, and we had a state object. So I kind of I understand like the concepts of it. It's just that at the moment in the projects that I work on, we don't need that. Although, like going off at a little bit of a tangent with the fast and looseness of JavaScript, I think that more established developers, older developers like myself, sometimes we lose that you could really do with something like TypeScript or the tighter control of things. Because the other day, I was speaking with a junior, and they had a problem with a function, and didn't understand why it was breaking, and it was for almost exactly the same reason that you gave in your example. They were just passing the wrong thing in. They were passing a string when they should have been passing a node, basically. Mm-hmm. So it was breaking. They couldn't understand why it was never breaking before, and it was simply that we always passed the right thing in before. Like now, that just seemed, as soon as that happened, I knew exactly what had gone wrong, but they didn't, and then it struck me, this is like this can't really like continue in the long term. It's just not good. And at that moment, I was like, maybe we should be using TypeScript in the project. Maybe we should incrementally add this. But anyway, that is going off at a tangent.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to like when Vue 3 properly comes out and supports TypeScript sort of first class in there. I think that will push a lot of adoption, and I think TypeScript is one. Like Flux isn't really taking off anymore, and as much as a Microsoft product, etc. I mean, they do good work. There's some really interesting stuff, and it's good for library builders as well. I had a conversation with someone the other day that was providing us a library And I was like, look, you say that this property is necessary. Why don't you enforce that in the type file? Like, tell me that this has to be here. And that there's these conditional types, and you can pass through a generics as well. And he was like, his mind was blown. It was super cool. It's helpful. I think that's the biggest key. And it's the same thing with RxJs. It's helpful when you're dealing with a lot of this. So in your example, your site currently I say, doesn't have a lot of asynchronous stuff really that isn't normal and isn't traditional. So yes, there's some stuff that your backend is giving you. It's technically still asynchronous, but they bundle it all together and deliver it with the HTML. So that's fine. That is state that is present when you do it. And then, button clicks or, working within an Angular app, that's you're not even to single page app territory yet. You're getting your data, and the changes that happen are very small. They only update locally. You still don't need any sort of helpers or frameworks for that. But what happens when you have to handle login or log out and they don't want you to refresh the page? It's not a huge difference, but now you suddenly have a button up there that needs to respond dynamically to whether this part of this variable within your code or your window or whatever is true or false. Then you start to kind of hack your way into it, right? It's not supernatural to do that. You have to have something that says watches for it. You have to use a mutation observer maybe. I
think you're right there. I mean, and it is interesting. I'm using the mutation observer more and more, and maybe that should tell me something. That is a very good point. Maybe that should tell me something. That do you really is the mutation observer really the thing that you want to use to solve this problem, or are you looking at, do you need some kind of state management? It's a really good point. It's genuinely something that I didn't think of. It's maybe I've become a little bit obsessed with I've discovered the mutation observer and the intersection observer, and sure. I'm like, wow, these are amazing. I'm going to use this again and again. But that goes back to before when I asked, is this always the right solution, or are you kind of blinded by it? Maybe I've been blinded by something else. So yeah, it's definitely something that I think it could be interesting to look at from my project's point of view. So maybe going out to the listeners, maybe this is something that we all take a look at, even when we think actually this isn't something we need. Maybe these are pointers that we do actually need to consider this different approach.
Well, and another thing is, it's easy to forget that you've been also dealing with certain asynchronous things for years, which is to say lazy loading of images, modularization of scripts, and dealing with not loading your CSS until it's needed, and things of that nature, right? It's a necessity that's built in to what we do, is to not do everything all at once, because that can overwhelm the CPU or the internet connection or the user's brain. So, there are those things that come into play. And it's interesting that we're moving more and more to having native solutions for this. So promises didn't used to exist. People were having a tough time. Now they do. Promises weren't built into Node. Asynchronous stuff wasn't really built into Node. Now, one of the creators of Node has spun up Deno to kind of rethink that and address this problem. And then the last point would be that, okay, we're moving into a web that is much more piecemeal, especially with HTTP2 and the ability to load a bunch of stuff in smaller chunks and change the way the page loads and things. And now we're looking at kind of JavaScript modules and importing. Lazy loading basically imports without anything complicated, just natively, use this NgRx extension if that takes off, or whatever the case is. It's becoming a really essential part of our jobs.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I mean, for me, everything now is, especially since HTTP2, is what can we deliver almost like just in time? Like deliver this when you need it, really like slim down everything else, and try and limit the amount of data that you actually send. Like really, so something like this, this kind of approach, I would see definitely like gaining traction. I mean, it already has for sure because of the frameworks, but there are in a traditional website like the project that I currently work on, where maybe we didn't see the need for it. In the future, it becomes more and more apparent. I certainly, like genuinely, like from the things you said in the last 10 minutes, genuinely, like that started to make me think about how could I actually introduce this. Now I think like a lot of the conversations that I have regarding like performance and improving performance could definitely relate to this. So yeah, I mean, like it's something already you've got me thinking.
Good. I'm glad. Yeah, I think there's a lot of, I mean, it's just an important skill to have. And again, coming back to the topic of the episode, thinking about things asynchronously and things over time, humans are just not good at that. I mean, some people are for sure, and you can get good at it, but intrinsically, it's really hard. People struggle to plan even like a month ahead, much less a year ahead. And in JavaScript time, or web page load time, 10 seconds is a year, right? So it's hard. Let's not take that for granted. And that's probably why it's not in pop culture so frequently as like, yeah, that guy's known for that because it's really easy for us to understand and follow. Superman is red and blue and a little bit of yellow. Fine. Perfect. I got it in my head. Time travel, time concepts are not that way. So, but it's time that we as frontenders started to pick that up. Okay. We're into that time where we get into our like segments and follow-up stuff. We have our normal segment, which is no longer new, True Heroes. In this segment, we want to highlight true front-end heroes working across the planet and thank them for all that they do. So far, we've been pretty localized, and today's choice is no different. This person that we're putting forward now, I think Scott and I both have really been influenced by when I started really working in front-end development. This guy was there to act as not just a mentor, which was part of the role he took on, but also as an example, right? Someone like a role model to look up to. He's younger than me. That's cool. Just goes to show. But what I always admired about him was that he was calm and creative and cared. And for me, those are really, ironically, 3 C's, but they really matter to being the kind of person that I want to be and the kind of engineer I want to be. So RxJs, Scott, you can correct me if I'm saying his name wrong. And perhaps to say his last name.
I think it's Grecian.
Oh, well, there you go. Yes, thank you for all that you do. And Scott, you can also add on here.
Yeah, I would echo all of the things that you just said. And he's a standout developer. Anybody who comes across him knows this. But as a little anecdote, it's his calmness. I think you definitely touched on it. His calmness, especially under pressure. And I remember his influence on me, particularly one sprint we had. He was I was panicking. There's no two ways about it. I could not make something work. I didn't understand why it didn't work. We were coming very close to delivery, and it still didn't work. And it was my responsibility. I mean, ultimately, as the lead, it was his responsibility, but it was something that I was working on. I remember going into the office super early, like spending hours, like trying to make something work. It didn't work. Really, I was concerned. And I remember Eric walked into the office, said, "Good morning. How's things going?" I immediately said, "It's going really badly. It's going really badly. I can't make this work. Like, we got delivery soon." And I can remember clear as day, he took his scarf off, his coat off, looked at me and said, okay, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to go and play a nice game of kicker. We're going to get a cup of coffee. We're going to maybe have some breakfast. And then we'll come down and we'll get on with the work. And I said, no, it doesn't work. You're not really understanding. And he said, no, come on, we'll go and do all of these things. Don't worry, this is going to be fine. And you know what? Like by the end of the day, it was fine. But and I really try and carry that through into my work now. Like I really try and put that across to people who work with me. Like, let's just calm down. Things are going to be okay. Like we just need clear heads. And I salute Eric every day for that.
One of the things that I really appreciated and for me was the role model, which I'm still not good at, was getting his ego out of the way. He is super talented and he is super good and he knows a lot about a lot of things, not just front end, but just, general soft skills are great too. But you don't hear him crowing about it. And, I'm bad about that. Like I'm not like, hey, look at me, I'm the best ever, but I tend to inject myself. One of the reasons we have this podcast is I like to talk. He would always sort of just take himself out of the equation. When we had our one-on-one meetings, it was like that. It wasn't, hey, this is what I've done. It's, I'm here to listen, tell me what you need, and ask the right questions at the right time. And then when the time came for me to actually step up and lead a project that he was still going to develop on because they weren't sure if they could trust me, he needed to be there as a fallback, he stepped back and let me run the show and feed him tickets as, need be. And it was kind of mind-blowing. That's a really hard thing, I think, to do when you love what you do and you're good at what you do and you know it, to have be humble enough to sort of step back and let other people shine too. So also calling him out, wonderful guy. Thank you so much. Well done, true hero. Any proper hero, of course, is a well-rounded one. So we're sharing our musical picks as well. I hope you liked it. If you have any comments, share them as well. I think it's a fun thing to do. So, Scott, what's the favorite thing you've been listening to lately?
I've been listening to, I'll nominate somebody. I nominate an album by Tame Impala. It's called The Slow Rush. I've listened to it a few times. I really like it. They're a band that, honestly, that I'm aware of, but like some of the things that they've done have like passed me by. So I would recommend that you check that out. And also, I've been listening to a lot of Joe Beving that you nominated a few episodes ago. Man, this stuff's really good for developing. Especially working from home and like the whole family's here. Like to put some of that on, it just like helps you focus. Really good. So that was a great pick by you.
Thanks. My pick this week is also a little more focus driven. It's moving a little towards what I honestly listen to more frequently than not, which is more like, I don't know, video gamey electronic kind of stuff. It's the soundtrack. I think it's the soundtrack to Hyper Light Drifter. Anyway, the album's called Hyper Light Drifter by Disaster Piece. Very ambient, very slow, instrumental, but there's some cool stuff, and it's pretty long as well. Like most tracks are 2 or 3 minutes long, and there's 28 tracks, so there's a lot of substance there, and it's good. I've been really enjoying going into that. So looks like that's all the time we have for today, folks. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, you should like, heart, or star us in your podcatcher of choice. Reviews and ratings are how the fancy algorithms help people find our content, and the power to help is within you. If you have any questions or topics you want covered in our next episode, send a tweet to us at HeroesFrontend on Twitter, and we'll add it to our list. And until next time, heroes, remember, with great front-end power comes great responsibility. See you next time.